The sweltering afternoon heat of Savannah, Georgia, pressed heavily against the large glass windows of the bustling downtown diner. Amidst the clinking of silverware and the loud chatter of tourists, an elderly woman sat entirely alone in a shadowed corner booth. Her frail hands were shaking so violently that the broth from her spoon spilled back into the porcelain bowl, over and over again. Waitresses hurried past with towering trays, and customers averted their eyes, pretending not to notice the quiet struggle happening mere feet away. No one stepped forward to ask if she needed assistance, entirely consumed by the selfish momentum of their own busy days. Valerie was 23 years old, balancing the crushing weight of 2 underpaying jobs, a stack of overdue rent notices, and a profound exhaustion that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her co-worker, Sarah, breezed past the Waitress station, complaining loudly about a massive party of 12 that had just walked in unannounced. Valerie had 5 tables actively demanding her attention, 2 missed orders sitting under the heat lamps, and a manager whose sharp glares communicated a constant threat of termination. She had absolutely no spare time, no excess energy, and nothing left to give. But when her eyes landed on the trembling woman, she stopped moving. She approached the table with a soft, unobtrusive grace. Eleanor looked up, her eyes holding the specific, heavy exhaustion of someone who had silently asked for help 1,000 times, only to be met with averted gazes. It was the familiar, guarded look of a person who had learned the hard way never to expect kindness from strangers. "I have Parkinson's disease," the elderly woman whispered, her voice fragile, but carrying a quiet dignity that was almost painful to witness. "That is why I cannot manage this meal properly." Valerie took a slow, deep breath, mentally dismissing the chaotic noise of the restaurant and the impending fury of her manager. She made a silent, unceremonious decision right then and there. "Please wait just one moment, ma'am. I will bring you a fresh bowl of soup," she said warmly. She returned a few minutes later, pulled up an empty chair beside the elderly woman, and began to feed her. She moved with a genuine, unhurried calmness, entirely devoid of performative charity. She asked softly if there was anyone coming to pick her up, making sure the next spoonful was perfectly cooled. Directly across the crowded dining room, leaning discreetly against a brick pillar near the exit, a man had spent the last 17 minutes completely ignoring his cooling coffee. His name was Richard. He was 41 years old, the ruthless owner of 3 highly profitable logistics companies, and a man whose reputation was forged in absolute emotional detachment. His assistant, Marcus, had been texting him urgently regarding a multi-million-dollar merger, but Richard's phone remained silenced in his pocket. He was entirely captivated by the extraordinary scene unfolding at the corner table. Richard watched his mother smile, and it was not the polite, strained expression she usually reserved for obligatory social functions. It was a radiant, genuine smile that reached the corners of her eyes, a beautiful sight he had not witnessed in years. A deeply uncomfortable realization began to take root in his chest as he observed them. He thought about how many times his own highly paid executives had blatantly ignored Eleanor at corporate dinners, shifting their gazes to avoid the discomfort of her trembling hands. Everyone in his elite circle knew exactly who she was, yet not a single person had ever extended the simple, instinctive grace that this overworked waitress was currently providing. When Valerie finally stood up to return to her grueling shift, Eleanor reached out and grasped the young woman's wrist with a sudden, surprising strength that defied her fragile appearance. "What is your beautiful name, my dear?" she asked earnestly. "Valerie," the waitress replied with a shy, tired smile. "Valerie, what a lovely name for such an incredibly lovely soul," Eleanor murmured. Valerie felt a rush of warmth flood her cheeks, quickly turning away to tend to table number 5 before the irritated guests walked out. She never looked back, completely unaware that she was being observed by a man who could change her life. The moment Valerie disappeared into the kitchen, Richard abandoned his post and walked over to his mother's table, sliding into the exact chair the waitress had just vacated. He stared at the empty soup bowl, his sharp features softened by an emotion he could not quite articulate. "Has she been working in this establishment for a long time?" he asked quietly. Eleanor simply shrugged her delicate shoulders, with the peaceful indifference of someone who only cared about the present moment. "She was just profoundly kind, Richard. And sometimes, that is all a person truly needs to know," she replied. Richard remained silent, but he immediately raised his hand to summon the restaurant manager. In the brief span of 15 minutes, Richard unearthed a comprehensive profile of the young woman that shook the very foundations of his cynical worldview. Valerie had been employed at the diner for 20 consecutive months, without a single complaint or unexcused absence. She consistently arrived earlier than the kitchen staff and left long after the floors were mopped. On weekends, she delivered groceries across town just to afford a cramped apartment shared with a messy roommate in Savannah's most neglected neighborhood. Despite her grueling reality, she treated an unknown, ailing woman with infinitely more dignity than most affluent people afforded their own flesh and blood. Richard lingered at the table long after his mother had finished her meal and departed with her driver. When Valerie eventually circled back to wipe down the laminated surface, he called out to her. His voice was stripped of its usual commanding corporate bark. Instead, it held a tentative, searching quality. He politely asked if she had ever met his mother prior to this afternoon. Valerie furrowed her brow, her damp rag pausing on the table. "No, sir. I have never seen her before in my life. Why do you ask?" she replied, genuinely confused by the intense scrutiny of the wealthy stranger. "Because you cared for her with the tenderness of someone who had known her for a lifetime," Richard stated simply. Valerie blinked, wiping her hands on her stained apron, still failing to grasp the gravity of the conversation. "She just looked like she needed a little bit of help, sir, and offering a few minutes of my time was the only thing I had to give," she explained matter-of-factly. Richard reached into his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a pristine, minimalist business card containing nothing but his name and a private phone number. He placed it on the table, telling her to call him the next morning because he had a highly lucrative job proposal for her. Valerie stared down at the expensive card, then looked up at the intimidating man, her expression shifting from confusion to a quiet, unshakable resolve. She picked up the card by the edges and slid it carefully back across the table toward him. "With all due respect, sir, I did not sit with your mother to earn a tip or a favor," she said firmly. "Thank you for the offer, but I absolutely do not need a reward for basic human decency." Richard froze, entirely immobilized by the rejection. In his world, no one ever walked away from his money. Valerie spun on her heel and pushed through the swinging doors into the chaotic kitchen, blissfully unaware of the psychological earthquake she had just triggered. She had inadvertently awakened a buried, dormant piece of Richard's humanity, a piece that no amount of corporate acquisitions, soaring profit margins, or material triumphs had managed to touch in over a decade. That evening, as the humid Georgia night settled over the city, Eleanor called her son. "Richard, do you know what your massive company is truly lacking?" she asked gently. When he asked her what, she replied, "You need more people who do the right thing when they believe nobody is watching." Sleep completely evaded Richard that night. He lay in his expansive, empty penthouse, staring blankly at the dark ceiling, while Valerie's dignified refusal played on a continuous loop in his mind. Her reaction possessed a remarkably rare combination of traits he had long ceased looking for in the corporate sphere. Immense pride, without a trace of arrogance, and profound dignity, completely untouched by bitterness. When the sun finally rose, he knew exactly what he had to do. He bypassed his morning meetings, instructing Marcus to cancel his entire schedule, and drove his luxury sedan straight back to the humble downtown diner. Valerie was already there, meticulously arranging silverware on the tables before the morning rush. This time, Richard did not bring his intimidating business card or his aggressive negotiation tactics. Instead, he brought his mother, alongside a newfound humility that had taken him 41 years to finally learn. "You made it perfectly clear yesterday that you had no desire to work for my company," Richard began, keeping a respectful distance. "I heard you, and I respect your principles. So please allow me to alter the question. Would you consider working directly alongside my mother?" Eleanor stood quietly by his side, her eyes crinkling with that same warm, authentic smile from the day before. Richard explained that they did not want a clinical nurse. They desperately needed someone of true character who would treat Eleanor like a human being. Valerie stopped her work, clutching a handful of silver forks, and took a long, deep breath. She looked between the powerful businessman and the gentle elderly woman. This time, she did not push the offer away, entirely unaware that this single choice made in a noisy breakfast diner would unravel secrets that would change their 3 lives forever. Richard had walked into the diner that morning without a shred of his usual imposing authority, taking his seat at the exact same corner booth. He ordered a black coffee he had absolutely no intention of drinking, letting the mug warm his hands. He was a man strictly conditioned to control every minor variable in any given environment, but the scent of toasted sourdough and the chaotic clattering of ceramic plates consistently disarmed him. Valerie heard the bell chime as they entered, and her stomach immediately tightened. It was not a feeling of fear, but rather the heavy, complicated anxiety that accompanies the prospect of sudden, life-altering change. For someone like Valerie, who had built a fragile sense of stability entirely through grueling physical labor and not through sheer luck, a sudden change always carried an implicit, terrifying risk. She forced herself to finish serving a stack of pancakes to table number 3, before finally wiping her hands and walking over to the corner booth. Eleanor greeted her with a bright, enthusiastic, "Good morning, Valerie." The 2 women exchanged smiles that felt strangely familiar, almost as if they were old friends reuniting after a long absence, rather than strangers who had met less than 24 hours ago. Richard observed this immediate, easy affection with a painful knot tightening in his chest. His mother was notoriously difficult to please when it came to hired help. She had spent the last several years building impenetrable emotional walls against highly trained nurses, expensive specialists, and professional companions who were paid exclusively to monitor her health. Yet, an overworked waitress in a stained uniform had effortlessly dismantled those defenses in less than a quarter of an hour. "My mother needs a true companion," Richard explained, his voice softer and much more careful than the tone he used in boardrooms. He detailed the parameters of the position clearly. He did not want someone to enforce strict medical protocols. He wanted a person to sit on the porch, sip coffee, accompany Eleanor to her endless doctor appointments without acting profoundly inconvenienced, and patiently listen to her recount the same nostalgic stories without rolling their eyes. Valerie crossed her arms slowly, a defensive posture born of years of surviving alone. "Why me?" she asked skeptically. "You do not know the first thing about me, my background, or my qualifications." Richard nodded in quiet agreement. "You are completely right. I do not know you at all," he conceded gently. "But yesterday I watched you work, and I saw a quality that cannot be taught in any prestigious university or bought with any exorbitant salary. You did not look around the room hoping for an audience, and you certainly did not expect a financial reward. You simply saw a human being struggling, and you chose to stop." Valerie stared at him, the loud background noise of the diner fading away. She suddenly thought of her grandmother, whose frail, shaking hands she had held tenderly during her final, agonizing weeks of life. What exactly would the daily schedule look like? Valerie asked, her voice betraying a flicker of genuine interest. Richard released a breath he did not realize he was holding. It was the very first practical question she had asked. He explained she would be needed Monday through Friday, from morning until late afternoon, with all weekends completely free. Furthermore, if she desired, she could move out of her run-down apartment and occupy a spacious, comfortable guest suite in Eleanor's massive historic home, completely rent-free, with absolutely no duties other than just being present. Then, Richard calmly stated the proposed monthly salary. Valerie blinked hard, her mind struggling to process the spoken words. The figure he offered was exactly triple the combined income she currently earned from breaking her back at both of her exhausting jobs. It was precisely at this moment that a sharp pang of deep-seated distrust flared within her. Life had brutally taught Valerie that whenever an opportunity appeared miraculously perfect for someone of her low social standing, there was always a devastating, hidden catch waiting to destroy her. "Why so much money?" she demanded sharply. "Because my mother's peace of mind is worth exactly that much," Richard replied without breaking eye contact. "And because I want you to stay by her side as a personal choice, not because you are financially trapped." Eleanor shifted slightly in her wooden chair and placed her trembling hand gently over Valerie's. "May I tell you a short story, my dear?" the elderly woman asked softly. Eleanor spoke of a young, exceptionally bright maid named Claire, who had worked for their family decades ago, long before the illness took hold. As Eleanor described Claire's selfless, quiet nature, Richard's face darkened with a sudden, ancient grief, signaling that a deeply buried ghost had just entered the room. The name Claire hung suspended in the heavy air of the diner, floating above their table like thick, suffocating smoke. The chaotic symphony of the restaurant around them, the clashing of silverware, the shouting of the line cooks, the laughter of tourists, felt entirely disconnected from the profound gravity settling over the corner booth. Eleanor explained that Claire was a remarkably intelligent young woman from a deeply impoverished background who had worked diligently in their grand estate. She had tragically fallen pregnant. The father had cowardly vanished, and when her little boy was exactly 3 years old, Claire simply disappeared into the ether without a single note of explanation. "I ended up raising the boy myself," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the ancient memory. "What else could a person possibly do?" He cried out for his mother every single night, for agonizing months. Valerie felt a sudden, sharp lump form in her throat. She understood the devastating mechanics of abandonment. She had witnessed its destructive path in her own neighborhood, and she carried a smaller, yet similarly painful version of it within her own heart. Eleanor revealed that they searched endlessly for years, but as Richard grew older and comprehended the situation, his heartbreak violently mutated into a bitter, unyielding rage. He eventually demanded that Eleanor cease all efforts to find the woman who had discarded him, insisting that anyone capable of such cruelty did not deserve to be found. Richard stood perfectly still beside the table, completely paralyzed by a conversation he had spent his entire adult life desperately avoiding. Valerie looked up at him, and for the very first time, she did not see a wealthy, intimidating corporate titan. She vividly saw the shattered, abandoned 3-year-old boy desperately waiting by the window for a mother who would never walk back through the front door. "You do not have to share this with me," Valerie said softly, feeling intrusive. But Richard finally sat down heavily in his chair, staring blankly at the dark surface of his cold coffee. "My mother chose to tell you," he said, his voice stripped of all its former armor. "And when my mother makes a choice, she is very rarely incorrect." He took a shaky breath and dropped a bombshell that sucked the oxygen straight out of the booth. "I found Claire," he stated quietly. Eleanor's trembling hands froze completely mid-air. 3 years ago," Richard added. The silence that instantly followed was overwhelmingly dense, a suffocating vacuum that made Valerie want to shrink into the vinyl seat. "You knew for 3 entire years, and you never said a single word to me?" Eleanor asked, her voice entirely devoid of anger, but heavily saturated with an unimaginable exhaustion. Richard confessed that he kept it a secret because Claire's current reality was incredibly complicated. She was severely ill, living entirely alone, and most shockingly, she had spent the last several decades desperately trying to find them. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears finally escaping and tracing the deep lines of her weathered face. Richard admitted he was terrified of his own conflicting emotions, torn between the angry child who wanted revenge and the adult who sensed a deeper, hidden truth. When I finally confronted Claire, Richard continued, his voice trembling slightly, she told me exactly what happened on that terrible morning she supposedly ran away. He laced his fingers tightly together on the tabletop, his knuckles turning stark white. She did not leave because she wanted to abandon me. Someone explicitly forced her to leave. Eleanor's eyes snapped open, a horrifying realization dawning in her expression. Richard revealed that the architect of this tragedy was Edward, Eleanor's own brother, the ruthless man who had completely controlled the vast family finances until his death 6 years prior. Edward had intercepted the terrified 22-year-old mother at the back gates of the estate. He threatened Claire with absolute destruction, promising that if she ever attempted to see her son again, he would fabricate evidence to have her violently arrested for grand theft. He swore he would ensure she never found employment in the entire state of Georgia, effectively guaranteeing her and her son would starve in the streets. She was just a young girl, totally alone and utterly terrified. So she ran to protect me, Richard explained, the long-suppressed fury finally bleeding into his words. Eleanor wept openly now, a silent, devastating release of 40 years of misplaced grief and manipulated guilt. She realized her own brother had systematically convinced her to abandon the search, poisoning her mind with lies about Claire's character. Valerie instinctively jumped up, rushed to the Waitress station, and quickly returned with a fresh glass of ice water and a stack of clean napkins. She placed them gently before Eleanor, rubbing the weeping woman's shaking back. Through her tears, Eleanor looked up at Valerie and pleaded, "I need to go see her immediately. Will you please come with us?" Valerie, entirely forgetting her shifts, her rent, and her fears, simply nodded her head. The vast, sun-baked highway stretched out endlessly before them, cutting a straight, gray line through the heart of rural Georgia, flanked by towering pines and an overwhelmingly massive blue sky. Richard gripped the leather steering wheel with white knuckles, driving the luxury sedan in absolute, impenetrable silence. Eleanor occupied the passenger seat, her gaze fixed stubbornly on the blur of passing trees, mentally preparing herself to confront the living ghost she had mourned for 4 decades. Valerie sat quietly in the spacious back seat, holding her worn canvas backpack securely in her lap, feeling like a tiny extra in a sprawling cinematic tragedy. Nearly an hour passed without a single syllable spoken within the insulated cabin of the car. It was Eleanor who finally shattered the heavy quiet, utilizing her remarkable ability to address profound subjects with the casual tone of discussing the weather. "Do you have any family of your own, Valerie?" she asked gently, peering through the gap between the leather seats. Valerie adjusted her grip on her backpack. "I had my grandmother, but she passed away 2 years ago. I have absolutely no one else," Valerie replied plainly. She paused for a fraction of a second before adding, "My mother left when I was 3 years old." She delivered the devastating fact without a hint of theatrical drama, speaking with the practiced detachment of someone who had chewed on a painful truth for so long that it had completely lost its sharp edges. "I have no idea where she is," Valerie concluded quietly. Eleanor turned her body slightly further toward the back. Richard kept his eyes intensely focused on the asphalt, but his broad shoulders tensed visibly beneath his tailored shirt. "What was your mother's name, dear?" Eleanor inquired. Valerie did not immediately grasp the immense looming shadow behind the simple question, so she answered honestly. "Claire," Valerie said softly. Her name was Claire. The luxury sedan did not violently swerve, nor did the tires screech in protest, but the very atmosphere inside the vehicle irrevocably shattered. Richard released a shaky, uneven breath, slowly pulling the heavy car onto the gravel shoulder of the deserted highway and shifting it into park. Eleanor sat perfectly rigid, as if she had been abruptly turned to solid stone. Valerie, who had spoken her absent mother's name hundreds of times without it ever invoking anything but emptiness, suddenly felt a terrifying, electric weight pressing down upon her chest. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Valerie asked, panic beginning to edge into her voice. Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it, and then forced the words out. "Exactly how old are you, Valerie?" she whispered. 23. Valerie answered instantly. The terrifying mathematical reality crashed down upon them with brutal clarity. Claire had been violently banished from the estate exactly 40 years ago. She had lived a quiet, isolated life in the shadows, eventually giving birth to a daughter 23 years ago, only to vanish from that child's life when she was precisely 3 years old. "Oh my God, Richard!" Valerie gasped, the horrifying realization hitting her nervous system before her brain could even process the absolute impossibility of the situation. Richard slumped forward, resting his forehead heavily against the steering wheel, covering the back of his neck with trembling hands. He was exactly 3 years old when Claire was forced away. Valerie was exactly 3 years old when her mother disappeared. They shared the identical trauma, the identical wound, and the identical mother, their lives kept entirely separated by geography and cruel circumstance, until a random act of kindness in a diner forced their universes to collide. Eleanor frantically asked if Valerie possessed a photograph. With shaking fingers, Valerie unzipped her backpack and pulled out an ancient, severely faded photograph from a battered envelope she carried everywhere, like a sacred relic. She handed it to Eleanor. The elderly woman stared down at the image of the young woman with bright, clear eyes and a timid smile. A choked sob escaped Eleanor's lips. "It is her," she wept, clutching the photo to her chest. "It is my Claire." Richard refused to look. He did not need visual confirmation. He was staring blindly at the road, his entire identity fracturing and reforming in real time. "Did you know?" Valerie demanded, her voice shaking violently as she stared at the back of Richard's head. "Did you know who I was?" Richard finally lifted his face, his eyes red and brimming with unshed tears. "No, I swear to you, I did not know," he rasped, his voice raw with absolute honesty. "When I found her, she never mentioned she had another child. But yesterday, when you said you were abandoned at 3, I suspected the truth." Eleanor reached out and gently touched Valerie's knee. "Perhaps the universe decided this was the exact right time," she said softly. Richard put the car in drive, and they surged forward toward their shared mother. They eventually pulled onto a quiet, unassuming street in a small town located 4 hours from Savannah. The house before them was remarkably modest, not dilapidated, but clearly inhabited by someone who had learned to survive strictly on the barest essentials. It featured a simple wooden porch, pristine white curtains drawn across the windows, and a thriving basil plant resting on the sill, its dark soil indicating it had been lovingly watered that very morning. A neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, paused her sweeping to observe the expensive car idling awkwardly at the curb. Richard gripped the steering wheel, completely paralyzed by the magnitude of the moment. Valerie stared intensely at the peeling paint of the front door, experiencing the deeply unsettling sensation of recognizing a home she had absolutely no memory of ever visiting. She possessed no mental image of her mother's face, only a gaping void in her history shaped exactly like a person. Richard finally forced his door open, driven by a desperate, physical need to move before his courage completely evaporated. Valerie stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk, offering her arm to help Eleanor stand, naturally resuming her role as caretaker despite the emotional hurricane destroying her internal world. Richard walked up the short concrete path and knocked firmly on the wooden door. The agonizing silence that followed stretched into an eternity. Eleanor closed her eyes, silently cursing her deceased brother Edward for the decades of stolen joy. Richard mentally calculated the years he had foolishly wasted stewing in misplaced anger instead of seeking the truth. Valerie clutched the straps of her backpack, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Finally, they heard the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone approaching from the other side. The door creaked open, revealing a woman carrying the heavy weight of a difficult life. Claire was 62 years old, her hair completely silver and chopped short in a practical style. Her face bore deep lines, carved by years of relentless anxiety and profound sorrow. Yet she radiated an undeniable, quiet dignity. Her eyes, however, were strikingly clear, the exact same bright, expressive eyes that belonged to Valerie. Claire looked up at Richard first, her breath catching audibly in her throat. Decades of agonizing separation dissolved in an instant. "Hello, Mom," Richard whispered, his voice shattering into 1,000 pieces, sounding entirely like the heartbroken little boy who had waited by the window for 40 years. Claire covered her trembling mouth with both hands, tears spilling freely down her weathered cheeks. Her eyes then shifted, registering Eleanor's tear-streaked face with a look of overwhelming gratitude. Finally, her gaze landed on the young woman standing near the porch steps. The entire world seemed to screech to an absolute halt. Claire stared at Valerie, not with shock, but with the devastatingly painful recognition of a mother seeing a piece of her own soul returned. "I named you Valerie," Claire sobbed, stumbling forward and wrapping her arms desperately around the daughter she had been forced to leave behind 20 years ago. Inside the cramped, meticulously clean living room, Valerie immediately noticed a single, small picture frame hanging prominently on the main wall. It held a photograph of a sleeping 3-year-old toddler. "You kept my picture?" Valerie asked, her voice cracking. Claire nodded, wiping her face with a tissue. She explained the heartbreaking truth. After fleeing Edward's threats, she had tried to return for Valerie years later, only to discover that Edward had manipulated Valerie's grandmother. He had convinced the grandmother that Claire was a drug-addicted runaway, legally blocking Claire from ever making contact or reclaiming her precious child. Claire poured them cups of coffee, confessing that she had been diagnosed with a severe heart condition 2 years ago. Fearing she would die alone, she finally reached out to Richard. Richard had secretly paid for the expensive life-saving surgery, but he had selfishly begged Claire for time to process his anger before introducing her to Eleanor or finding Valerie. The surgery was a complete success. Claire smiled weakly, looking at her 2 adult children. "I just wanted to see your faces before my time in this world finally ran out." Valerie looked around the room, feeling an immense, powerful warmth flooding her chest. Valerie turned to Eleanor and Richard, a profound sense of clarity washing over her. "I am absolutely accepting the job," she announced firmly. "But we are all moving into the estate together, and we will share the caretaking." Richard smiled, a massive, unburdened expression of pure joy, and eagerly agreed. As we navigate the chaotic, overwhelming demands of our daily existence, it becomes incredibly easy to walk past the quiet suffering of those right beside us. Yet, the most extraordinary miracles do not arise from carefully calculated business plans or sudden strokes of immense wealth. They are born in the simple, unglamorous moments when we choose to pause, offer our undivided attention, and extend a hand to a stranger in pain. The compassion you casually give to the world has a beautiful, mysterious way of circling back to heal the deepest, oldest wounds within your own life. True fulfillment is never found in avoiding the burdens of others. It is found in the incredible grace of choosing to stay, to sit down, and to listen, trusting that love will eventually put all the broken pieces exactly where they belong.